You're listening to Precinct 444, a podcast network from the National Law Enforcement Museum. Today we're bringing you an episode from Icons, where listeners are introduced to incredible people working within the law enforcement community who have made a profound impact in our world. These one-on-one interviews provide insight into their lives and careers so we can better understand their challenges and recognize their bravery, commitment, and sacrifice. Welcome to Precinct 444. I'm Christopher Mitchell, the producer of Precinct 444 and manager of digital content and strategy at the National Law Enforcement Museum. Today's series is truly a special one. As we're nearing the end of Pride Month, we here at the Precinct wanted to leave a lasting impression on everyone by releasing the 6 full oral histories of the participants featured in the digital exhibit Experience Pride Behind the Badge, the history of LGBTQIA+ in law enforcement, published today. A link to the exhibit can be found in the episode descriptions from this series. If you're listening to these episodes on the original published date, a companion program is set to air this coming Wednesday, June 28th at 2 p.m. Be sure to register using the link found in the episode descriptions. The purpose behind these projects is to share the often untold stories of LGBTQIA+ and law enforcement through their own words. They come from all walks of life and all types of law enforcement. Last but certainly not least is part 5 of this series featuring Michael Crumrine. He discusses his 35-year career in law enforcement, spanning multiple positions, despite dealing with hurdles that had him rethink his career. And now for part 5 of Pride Behind the Badge featuring Michael Crumrine.
So the reason I wanted to get into law enforcement, I came from a family that my parents were very much involved with the community over time. And I was raised with a father and a mother who believed that if you were able to make a difference, if you were able to give back, that it was kind of an obligation for you to do so. And I had an older brother who had gone into the military, and then my 2 eldest sisters married career military individuals, and that was an avenue that I was exploring myself. And things didn't work out me going into the military, and I always had a desire to try to help others. I absolutely despise bullies. It's just something that's a very deep personal thing of mine. And so I realized I had the ability to go into a profession that could be a voice for the people who didn't have a voice, and to help individuals when they were at their most vulnerable to hopefully find some sort of relief and some sort of justice. When I was in high school, a good friend of mine he was a volunteer fireman, and I worked in an area where we had a volunteer fire department as well. And I always thought that was super cool to do. So I was a volunteer fireman for a while, and I got to know the policemen and know others that were around working in the field of public safety. And it just seemed like a really good fit for me. So I began my law enforcement journey back in 1987 when I had the ability to go to my first academy, and yeah, so that's when it started, way back in 1987.
Sounds very similar to a lot of other participants and other law enforcement professionals, where they just have that calling, and maybe they don't necessarily know that it's law enforcement initially, but then it sort of dawns on them after a while that maybe law enforcement is the route to go. I can make the biggest difference in law enforcement and serving the community, and helping the public and helping those who need it.
Absolutely.
And so as a person who identifies as LGBTQ+, did you have any reservations about entering law enforcement?
I didn't back then, but I was struggling with who I was as a person, right? I grew up in San Antonio, Texas, very heavily Catholic conservative community. I was born and raised in the Catholic Church, went to private parochial school my whole life. So I knew there was something different about me, but I didn't quite stand, the full picture of that. And so, I had my own kind of struggles with my identity and who I am because my family and the church and the community that I was in preached and taught one thing, and then I had this other thoughts and feelings about myself. So there was this internal struggle that was going on in my life at the time that I entered into law enforcement. What I did know is at that moment in time in 1987 in Central Texas, who I was struggling with could never become public because doing that would have meant just my absolute destruction as far as career wise, being able to make a living in this profession. So it was this really big internal struggle that I was going through. Um, when I entered law enforcement, shortly after entering law enforcement, I was married. I was married to a woman, my ex-wife. We had a child together. Who My daughter is the most amazing person in my life, and somebody I thank every single day for for her being in my life. So, to answer your question, there wasn't a hesitation. It was I knew I had this desire to give back and do better. But I also knew that this internal struggle of who I truly was something I was still trying to figure out. One, and then two, I knew I absolutely had to keep that hidden from everybody else, moving forward. So that was a challenge in life at that moment.
That willingness and that desire to serve taking precedence over somebody else's either mental health or their true self. So in that sense, they're going into law enforcement to serve others, but they can't really be who they really want to be because of, you know, the time that they're in, the time they're serving. They can't be open and honest with those around them, and they're having to kind of put on a little bit of a facade kind of thing. So
No, and it eventually got to a point in my career where all of that crashed and became public. And so those were very, very defining moments for me. The 80s was a really, really interesting time in America, in Texas. There were so many different things going on in society in regards to the LGBTQ plus community. It wasn't that too far. It was only a decade or so prior, right? Stonewall had happened, and kind of the movement towards acceptance was out there. And then, I grew up in a time in the 80s where, Anita Bryant, out of Florida, God love Florida again, here we go. That was really pushing the demonization of anybody who was queer identified. And some people, I'm sure, listening to this conversation isn't going to know what I'm talking about because they didn't live it, they didn't experience it. But and some of the other people you talk to may have spoken to this, but Anita Bryant was a very well known celebrity out of Florida. Florida, I believe it was in Miami. I could be wrong on the city. Was attempting to write into their housing laws, right, for the city that they couldn't discriminate against people based upon sexual orientation. And this was a mantle that Anita Bryant took up and started to demonize queer identified individuals. She's the one that was really big in spinning the myth that gay men only want to indoctrinate your children and indoctrinate and create more gay men by preying on kids. That myth and myth conception that queer identified men specifically were pedophiles moving forward, and so there was this huge demonization of us as a community, which when you're in this field, right, it makes you run either further back into the closet because you see this vitriol that's out there that people are trying to push. And so going through that, you also had the AIDS epidemic of the 80s that was also going on as well, and the country struggling with how do we handle this, and do we handle this appropriately as a health crisis, or is this people trying to find, or as it was being spun, right, like AIDS was a retribution for a sinful lifestyle, right, and it's just the gay disease, and it's the gay cancer and all that. So a lot of really, really super powerful forces and movements and feelings and emotions. And when you're a young gay man, because I started law enforcement when I was 21, as early as you could start law enforcement in the state of Texas, you have to be 21 years of age to be licensed. And so, you're seeing all of this and you're struggling with who you are as a person. It definitely was a scary, scary time in our lives, but you also have this desire to try to do good. You just want to serve, right? I wanted to do and and be considered as proud, to have my family proud of me, like they did my eldest brother, like they did my brother-in-laws, right? That were serving in the military. I equated their service to their country the same thing as my service to my community in being a law enforcement officer. So a lot of very strong strains that were put on me at that time in my career.
What was your earlier career like? Late 80s, early 90s was still very much a tumultuous time in this country, and I know in law enforcement, and especially within the gay community as well.
Yeah, 100%, right? And you when your only frame of reference growing up, right? it- Consider the time. It's not 2023 where I have the internet, where I have the ability to do research, where I can connect with people from all over the world, connect with anybody much outside of my community, right? It is a very closed society in a lot of ways. And so you have these feelings, these emotions, this internal struggle, but there's no outlet. And so I had no frame of reference of what it would be like to be a queer identified police officer or a queer identified person, period. And so my internal struggle is because the Catholic Church was teaching at the time, others were teaching at the time, that to be gay, that it was a mental disorder, right? That somehow you're broken, you're not normal. And I'm like, but I am normal, right? Like, I don't want to hurt myself. I'm not crazy. I'm not doing bad, I'm not harming people. I just have these different thoughts and feelings over who I love and how I identify, right? So it was this struggle of if I don't know a healthy or another alternative, right? Like, because I that wasn't exposed to me, I was struggling with, if I explore that, that means I'm mentally broken, when that's really not the case. But that was kind of the mindset that I had at the time. So, I mean, I loved my wife. I did. There's no doubt about that. But I also realized there was this giant hole in me that was never fully complete, and I was living a lie.
Did you, ever consult with other law enforcement professionals during your earlier career about not maybe necessarily who you are, but just, did you hear anything that made you really second guess about entering the law enforcement profession?
There was those conversations, and I just remained silent. I found myself over a period of time when these conversations came up around people, right, that I would just walk away from them. As I started to understand myself more, I just would walk away from those conversations, still not fully understanding them, and understanding myself. But I realized that in my profession, they and understand at that moment in time, it was illegal to be gay in Texas. We had our homosexual conduct law on the books, which I was instructed about, right? And that wasn't overturned until Lawrence v. Texas in 2003. So it was illegal for me to do this. But you know what? When you're a cop, there's a lot of things, right? Like cops would get around and you would go to a choir practice or other things would happen, right? Like I realized that this was this internal struggle, but there's so many laws on the books at the time that never made sense anyway, that we didn't necessarily enforce. And I didn't know any officers that enforced this law at the time, but it was still on the books. And so for me, getting into the business of being a police officer, I had been, you know, a star football player. I was the captain of the football team. I was, um, the head of our ROTC program. I was second in command, not the head, but I was the chief. Basically the chief of staff, the executive officer for a very large ROTC program at the school I went to, and so this sense of honor duty, being into a club, having access into those clubs of privilege was just natural. I mean, I'm 6'1". I was 245 pounds at the time, very well in shape. Um, Came from a family that was well known within the city of Austin, right? So there was this whole privilege of me being able to walk in this realm of the same people that, on one hand, are accepting you because you're a white cisgender male into a profession. Um, so I was able to do so many different things that this part of my life about being gay that people were demonizing and making comments about, that I I just compartmentalize that into, that's just but a small part of me, and I can control that, and I can not have that be such a defining person for me, because all these other things are what's defining me.
Were there any, earlier or later career experiences that made you, question your decision to enter law enforcement? Whether that be not necessarily the law enforcement profession as a whole, but as being, a queer identified man in law enforcement.
Yeah, it did. At times I knew I could play the game, right? Like I knew I could keep this part of my life secret and still serve and protect, because I truly believe, and even to this day, I'm very very adamant about this. I've been in this job 3.5 decades. I started in '87, so I'm in my 36th year of being a cop, right? um I I understood that, like, when the criminal justice system works the way it's supposed to work, it is brilliant. It brings justice to people, it brings closure to people, it helps people, it saves people, all of that stuff, right? um so all of that is, I still very much value that, and I was just trying to figure in where my identity fit, right? Like, but what I knew is if my identity was ever found out, I couldn't be part of that club anymore, not at that moment in time. And the desire to to be a part of that club and still help people that have been bullied and help victims was a stronger push for me than people knowing my identity.
law enforcement as a whole has definitely gone a lot of different directions. It's definitely not really been a linear sort of situation. There's been a lot of branching off into very difficult times for law enforcement, not even including the LGBTQ plus community that are actually in law enforcement. But do you have any advice for those that are, queer identified that are entering law enforcement or that would maybe one day want to enter law enforcement?
Great question. Yes, I have a lot of advice. Never, ever, ever allow anybody else to define your success. Never. Never sacrifice your authenticity to make somebody else feel comfortable. So, my journey, what ended up happening with me is I'll leave it like this on this conversation. Let's just say I was touched by the AIDS epidemic personally. And so that was other things that were going on in my life. And so what ended up happening is my wife and I divorced in 1995, and that's really when I started to understand who I was a little bit more. And my sexuality wasn't the reason we divorced. We divorced because uh, just marital issues, right? I was working a bunch. I was working a lot, trying to make ends meet. Not getting into that personal issues, but it didn't really have to do with my sexuality. But what ended up happening is when we divorced, all of this came out about who I was. My ex-wife knew all about me and the fact that I had relationships with men before we ever got married. And so she knew this from the jump. And when we got divorced shortly thereafter, I was going back for custody issues with my daughter. And my ex-wife and her then husband had threatened way back then that should I not kowtow or bend or do what they wish to happen with the custody arrangements, that they would out me, that they would go out publicly and they would tell everybody my story and everything about me. So um, they followed through on that promise. And in 1997, after a bitter court battle, my ex wife went to the local news station in San Antonio, Texas. Um, and for a week, that news station ran a story about the gay police officer fighting for custody of his daughter. And that's how my story got out there way back then. And so that was the colliding and the explosions of my two worlds, and I had a choice to make, um either to slink off into the sunset and or continue to do what I knew was right, which was being myself. And so, and this goes to why I say what I say about people coming into law enforcement, that advice of never let somebody like never diminish your authenticity for the comfort of somebody else. And so when all of this ended up coming out, a couple of days after that, I had to go to work. And you talked about people in your profession that would make fun of gays or were very opinionated about gays in law enforcement. And there was a guy, he worked for the San Antonio Police Department. I had worked for Castle Hills Police Department, a suburb. We ran calls together, got to be good friends. And his name was Alan. And so I come to work and he sends me a message on the MDC, we need to talk. And I'm like, I ignore the message, and I ignored the message because I had set for a couple of years having coffee with Alan when he would tell me how women shouldn't be in law enforcement, how fags shouldn't be in law enforcement. Those were the words he used. And then of course this was in the middle of the AIDS epidemic, and he had his comments about that as well as justification for their ways. And so he kept pestering me throughout the night. And finally, I gave in and I'm like, all right, let's meet. And so we met at a coffee shop and I got out of the car and I'm about to walk in and he stops me and he says, I just got to tell you something. And at this point, I'm like, I'm prepared. Like, this guy's going to tell me how worthless of a human I am and how I deceived him. And all of these things are running through my mind, right? Like, all of my insecurities are running through my mind. And he turns to me and he says, I just got to tell you, I was wrong. And I'm like, Alan, what does that mean? And he's like, my entire life, I had always thought that gays shouldn't be in law enforcement. He changed the word from fags to gays when he was talking to me. And I never saw a purpose or a place for them until I met you. And after meeting you and working with you, and I'm sorry if I get a little emotional when I talk about it because it's still a very emotional point for me. And he said, because I've known you and I know the kind of cop that you are, it made me rechange. It made me rethink who I am and what I think about things. And he goes, I just want you to remember something, Mike. I will forever be proud to walk through a door with you. And if you've talked to enough cops over a period of time, you understand what that means. That means that he is still willing and would actually be happy and proud and trusting of me to put his life in my hands and to make sure that at the end of the day, no matter what we faced in this world and no call that we went on, that he knew if he was next to me, that I would do everything I could to make sure he got home to his family every day. And that was the first time that I had been validated as who I truly was. So it was a very defining moment for me. And then, because he saw me and he realized that there's more to who we are as cops and to our integrity and our worthiness than just who we love. And that was important because he was the epitome of a just cop's cop in the way that he handled his business, right? So talking to young officers and telling the story, I tell them this because I I could easily walk away from this profession, and I refused and continue to refuse to allow somebody else to define my success. And so I stuck with it.
Yeah, for sure. And I'd be curious to know about how did things change, after that moment.
So the department I was in, there was a guy that was a sergeant in that department. I was an officer at the time. He was actually somebody who recruited me to come into the department. He was insanely homophobic. I After all this information came out, I found myself being targeted for internal affairs investigations, being denied promotion. Found out after I left that department because I left that department and went to Austin PD. Austin PD was welcoming, knew everything about me, was open minded, encouraging. And this was in 2001. So I went to APD in 2001 because this all came out in 97. Try to stay in that department and work, but I continue to be denied promotion and the ability to um, move forward and have other assignments. And what I ended up finding out was somebody who I thought was my friend um, was actually the one that was driving this boat and had told to several people behind my back, we'll be goddamn if we're ever going to promote a fag in this department. Um, and I didn't know that. So got targeted. I was about to get out of the business. I knew I needed to leave the department and Austin PD gave me an opportunity and I've been able to come here and do phenomenal things and have an amazing career. And now, I've with APD, I've moved from being a patrol officer to a sergeant in investigations. I was the first openly gay male in homicide. Was the first, as far as I know, openly gay male in the sex crimes unit. I am, one of the sergeants over child abuse. I've had the ability to learn and train and talk to people nationally, internationally. I've spent the better part of more than a decade in violent crimes, where I've worked, tons of major investigations, sexual assault, serial rapists, murders, sex offenders, large, huge cases with child predators. And it was all because I got the opportunity for a department to not look at my identity and look at my status and give me the opportunity to be me. So it changed. I'm not saying I haven't suffered some things here at APD, but holistically and overall, it's allowed me to thrive as as an officer, and do some incredibly cool things. Like I'm not the person with the idea, but I'm currently forming the Lesbian and Gay Peace Officers Association. But I'm certainly the current president right now, that I'm very proud of. But I was one of the founding members. The idea was Sergeant Steve McCormick's and Lieutenant Eric Cleveland's, and just had the privilege of doing some amazing things once given the ability to be me. So the Lesbian Gay Peace Officers Association, we were formed in 2009. Austin has always been and continues to be very open and welcoming towards the queer community, and opening and welcoming towards queer officers within its ranks. We actively recruit for queer identified officers, as we do with many other marginalized groups. But in 2009, two incredibly competent sergeants were trying to go out to the academy. There had already been two sergeants out there, a sergeant and lieutenant out there that was that identified as lesbian. A third sergeant was trying to come out there. She's incredibly qualified, and the commander at the time denied her transfer and had made the comment, if we have any more of them out here, what will people think of us? And we realized that at that moment in time, although the Austin Police Department, from our perspective, had always been open and welcoming, that there still was misconceptions, there was still bias, there was still prejudice that was within certain areas of the department. And so when we formed the Lesbian and Gay Peace Officers Association, known as LGPOA, we formed it on the three tenets of service, education, and protection. Service for our members, service back to the community, education on both parts, because even the queer community in Austin, hadn't engaged queer cops before, hadn't really done a lot with officers, right? So they didn't know, and there was education within our ranks, and there was education outside our ranks, and then obviously protection, right? But not only just for our members that are queer identified, but also for the community. And so, some of the things that we did once we got formed in 2009 is, shortly thereafter, in 2012, we were the second department in the country to do an It Gets Better video. And that was kind of us coming out, right? That was that was the organization's kind of public statement that we're here, and we're a group of individuals that just want to give back to the community, and that we're here for queer identified individuals to help protect them and to help make sure that they're safe, and to, especially with queer youth, right, with the Trevor Project, to give an inspiring message of, it does get better and things can be better. And if you want to go into this realm of being law enforcement, absolutely you can. There's this group, we're there, we're open, we're accepting, we're loving. all of those things. So that's how the organization got founded. And we've done amazing things over the past 13, 14 years that we've been around. So super, super excited about what we do. We're the first and only in the state of Texas. Still get called on a lot by people all across the state, asking us how we can be better, how they can be better, how they can improve, and how we can improve relations between the community and the criminal justice system.
Is there anything else that you would want people to know about your experience?
Being different, no matter what that is, right? Being from a different country, speaking a different language, looking different, being different, in regards to your identity or your orientation, right? It should never and ever come across, and you should never feel that in any way it's a liability. It's a blessing. It allows you to go ahead and connect with so many other people in this country who feel like I am not seen. It helps you in this profession remind everybody that has the privilege of putting on a badge and raising a hand that our oath that we take is to protect and serve every member of our community, every person that adds color and flavor and texture and sparkle and difference and makes America as great as it is. You're one of those people, and your uniqueness should be celebrated, not diminished. And it takes courage to do that. Trust me, it does. And there's going to be people that are going to come at you, and there's going to be people that are going to take shots at you. But in your heart of hearts, you're doing what is right. And that is what we take an oath to do every single day. We raise a hand voluntarily, we step forward and say, I will be one of those people. I will be one of those people that will hold the bullies accountable. I will be one of those people that will comfort you, that will protect you, that will shield you from some of the evils that are in this world. And that is a courage you take every day. We talk about law enforcement, what it means to have courage. When you're a unique officer, when you are queer identified, that courage is even more palpable because some people just don't want us to exist. Some people don't want you to be a part of an organization, but you deserve it every bit as much as the next guy. If you look at the demographics in society right now, Gallup puts this out. Every new generation is identifying with higher and higher percentages of queer identified individuals. The Zennial generation, according to Gallup right now, 1 in 5, nearly 20% of the Zennial population is identifying as queer identified individuals. Us as a profession are going to engage them. And as much as we want to shout at the mountain and say the mountain's not there, the mountain's there. And it's our job to explain to people we're not going away, but we're also not scary. We're also not somebody who wants to go ahead and take away whatever freedoms and privileges or whatever you want. We just want the same ones. And so, as a young queer identified officers, yeah, be yourself, demand the same as somebody else, but also help us bridge that gap between the community that needs us and the community of law enforcement that needs us even more. Because we cannot truly be public servants unless we're public servants to everybody. And the vast majority of cops I know, the vast majority I've known in my career, only want to do the right thing. They're scared of change. We all scared of change, but change is important because change makes us better. Change and inclusivity produces a much better product than the reverse. So yeah, that's the things I want young queer officers to know about. But I also want older administrators to know all we want is the same exact things that y'all have, and we want to help you be better at doing your job. Because when we in law enforcement do our job well, when we do it the way it's supposed to be done, it builds stability, trust, respect, admiration, and it keeps people safe. And that's ultimately what our job has been every day.
It's very well said. What sort of changes that you've seen in law enforcement over the last maybe decade or so that makes the law enforcement profession maybe a little more inviting to queer identified individuals compared to, even 20 years ago?
Yeah. And great question. Like, what have I seen? I've seen a profession become more open, more accepting, right? Like I have watched various different departments actively try to engage our community and are doing a much better job of that. I see us as a profession going ahead and celebrating what it is to be a queer identified officer. There's something we're doing in Austin, Texas in 2025. And it's the first time it's come to the country, right? Is that there's an international conference of LGBTQIA plus criminal justice professionals. And this has been an international conference that's traveled the world. It happens every 3 years. It's never been in the United States before. And for the very first time, it's coming to Austin, Texas, and we have the privilege of hosting that. I never believed back in 1987 that I would be able to stand in the center of the state of Texas, the state that had that their law was challenged and overturned at the Supreme Court, right? Concerning the homosexual conduct law, the Supreme Court making a decision to overturn all sodomy laws. I never thought that we would be able to have a conference like this and celebrate who we are. But then, it's not just that; it's also a forum for us to figure out what are we doing well and what can we do better. Where are we still not where we need to be? I've watched, especially the younger generation, right? Like, look at people for the value of what they bring to this profession, not judging people just because they're queer identified. You say, what are the other things that I've learned? So, because I think the symbols that we put out, right, like making us as a profession look more appealing, making us as a profession seem more inviting, isn't just limited to the LGBTQIA plus community, right? Like it is, when we do this, it makes our profession overall seem more accepting and more inviting. And so I'll tell you a little account. We have a pride car, and we put the pride car out, and we run the Safe Place Initiative, which is an anti-hate crimes initiative that was started in Seattle. It's traveled across the country, but the difference we did in Austin is so what it is it's a collaboration between businesses and law enforcement, because we know that most hate crimes happen in public, to create a safe venue that if somebody feels like they are being targeted for bias motivated crime, they can go to this business and stay safe while the police get called. And this was started by Jim Ritter in Seattle, Washington. It's spread across the country. And so what we did in Austin is we didn't just print these decals, because that's how you know what a safe place is there's a decal on the outside of the business, right? That designates it as a safe haven. And we printed all of those in 4 different languages, the main languages that were spoken in Austin, not just English, but English, Spanish, Vietnamese, and simplified Chinese. And so we have the pride car, and we put the stickers on the pride cars. We rolled it out, right? Because we're really proud of the Safe Place Initiative. And so there's a new recruiter in the the recruiting division, and he's Vietnamese, and he's not queer identified. He's at all. And so he gets in the pride car with my buddy, and he's sitting there like all doe-eyed, looking around, and he's a very chatty guy. So he was quiet and kind of dumbfounded for a little bit. And so my buddy was like, "What's wrong with you?" And he goes, "Wow, I'm in the pride car. This is so cool. Oh my God, this is awesome." Like he's getting super excited being in the pride car. And she's like, "Okay, it's the pride car." And he had not seen the decals on the side yet because he got in on the side and he didn't see him. And so when they get stopped, he walks out and he goes around, he looks at the pride decal and he sees the one that's in Vietnamese. And he stops dead in his tracks. And according to my friend, he gets a little bit of a tear in his eye and he points to that one and he says, "This is the first time in my career that my department sees me and my people. It's the first time I've ever experienced that." This goes to what I'm talking about with policing and being accepting of everybody. Because I truly believe when you wear certain things that show you have humanity, when you're able to have those conversations, when you're able to recognize people, and just doing something simple like putting the safe place sticker in Vietnamese, right, resonated with him. And he was able to see that our industry sees him, our industry is welcoming. And that's the changes that I've seen in law enforcement. We went through this area of really big community policing, and I'm very much on board with that, and that's something I truly believe in. And then, kind of 9/11 happened in 2001. I was already a cop. I'd actually 1 month to the day I graduated from the Austin Police Academy when 9/11 happened, and there was a shift in policing at that point. But there was a shift in the country as well, right? The shift in the country was, if it doesn't look like me, sound like me, act like me, you got to be suspicious of it, because that's the only way we could figure out how to fight this terrorism. But what that did is it kind of isolated us and siloed us. And I saw a shift in policing where we have not really gotten back to that community policing, but I'm seeing that now when I'm seeing departments take an effort to actively recruit LGBTQI people, when we celebrate this community, when we're in pride, when we put these symbols out, right? I'm seeing us start to swing that pendulum back to, I do see you, you do matter, which is what I think community policing is all about. And what I think our profession should be about is welcoming and accepting of everybody that wants to become a part of this community and is a part of the diverse culture that America is right now. So those are the great things I'm seeing that are happening, right? We're trying to change to make sure whoever needs us, wants us, that we're creating an open, inviting way for them to access us. And those things are the things that warm my heart.
Thanks for sharing, Michael. It's really great to hear a lot of positive progress has been made over the last 5 to 10 years, and that there is somewhat of an upward trend within law enforcement and inclusivity. But I also hate to think the fact that there is also an upward trend in hate crime within the queer community. And if you could also talk about that.
We are going back in creating environments where it is okay to to create violence against a group of people just because they exist,
Mm-hmm.
whomever that is.
Right.
We've gone to this realm of demonizing people for their very existence. And the FBI just came out a couple of days ago and it said that the rate of hate crimes, like almost 20% of reported documented hate crimes, are against the queer community, and they're starting to see that rise.
Mm.
And in no small part, do I think it's not also attributed to the type of laws that are being passed in certain parts of the country? And you've got to start asking yourself, right? Like the other question is, what damage are we doing to law enforcement officers when we have these laws that they know are inherently targeting certain members of the community? What stress are you putting on those officers, compelling them to make an arrest that they don't feel is morally justifiable? You know, you talk, there's a good friend of mine named Cynthia Deedle. She's queer identified, but she used to run the the hate crimes unit for the FBI out of New York. And she talks about, you know, the Jim Crow laws that were in effect, and you know, she's done a lot of work with hate crimes. But when you go back and you ask these officers now, when they were having to enforce these laws, and they talk about the vicarious trauma that they felt because they knew I was being told I had to do something that didn't set well with me, right? And so when we're trying to build bridges between communities, right? And the bottom line is, and I talk about this all the time when I train, that law enforcement officer is the public face of the criminal justice system. It is. We're
Exactly.
we're not the ones writing the laws. We're not the ones signing the laws. We're not the ones adjudicating the laws, but we're the one enforcing those laws. And it's that image of us doing that that resonates with so many different people. So so as an industry, when we're trying to reach the most marginalized of communities, yet we're being compelled, you know, to target those marginalized communities, how do we square that? Right? Like, I talk to any cop. Do you know any cop that wants to go enforce a bathroom bill? Not many. When you have these big efforts going on in our industry to try to reframe the discussion and build relations with people that we have harmed over the past, that we maybe not have the best relationship with, and then in another part of the country some of your team members are being compelled to enforce laws that are harming. Why? Why are we doing this? um I that's the part that, yes, things are better, but this is the one part that we've I really think very quickly we've got to put the brakes on. Otherwise, it's not going to help us get where we want to go, which is the fact that the majority of Americans look at this profession as an honorable profession that I want to get into and find value in what we do every day.
Yeah, exactly. I don't, and I think unless you actually have a passion and a profound respect for law enforcement, you're not going to see it in that kind of light. You're going to be, and it's not necessarily your fault as an individual for looking at law enforcement any differently than how the media portrays it. But
Sure.
at the same time, you know, they, like you said, they are the enforcers. It's a very, I mean, it's like a very personal, you know, commitment. And you know, it's not just like a, you know, obviously it's a very long career. A lot of the career law enforcement professionals are not there to just do their 20 years necessarily and then get out. Some of them will stay in until they're well into their 60s. You know, there's some that will wait until 20 years and then they're just gone. But a lot of them are fully committed, and it's not because it's just a job, it's a career, but it's also they do want to make that difference. There's things that can be done, there's improvement that needs to be made.
When we all come together, when our profession comes together and as one voice, it is insanely powerful as far as how it can influence things, the types of laws that can be influenced, right? Like, very much so. And so, you know, in whatever small way that I do what I do, I try to just get administrators to think of the bigger picture. What's the end game here? Where are we trying to go? What helps keep society safer? All of society. Because I use this quote of mine. It's not a quote of mine. It's a quote of a friend of mine, Andrea Munford, who's the chief of staff, assistant chief at Michigan State University. So anyway, her when we talk about things, she's a dear friend of mine. She's like, the reason these things matter, the reason that what we're talking about today, Chris, matters, is because inclusion's not an a la carte menu. It isn't. You don't get to pick and choose, right? If you're trying to be inclusionary and you're trying to make things safer. And I wish we as a profession, and I hope as a profession, we can start asking ourselves those questions. But that's that's why I try to challenge people when I speak to them is to ask themselves those questions. Are the actions I'm taking making society better or worse? I think people look at it at different lenses, but I know when, and I've said it a bunch of times in this interview, right? Like when our profession does what it's supposed to do for the right reasons, it does that. It checks that box. It makes society safer for the right reasons. If you go to the Jefferson Memorial on the side, I'm going to read you this quote because it's one of my favorite quotes because I think it ties to everything we're talking about here.
Sure.
And so this is one of the writings of Jefferson. He says, "I'm not an advocate for frequent changes in laws and constitutions, but laws and institutions must go hand in hand with the progress of the human mind. As that becomes more developed, more enlightened, as new discoveries are made, new truths discovered, and manners and opinion change, with the change of circumstances, institutions must advance also to keep pace with the times. We might as well require a man to still wear the coat which fitted him when he a boy, as civilized society to remain ever under the regime of their barbarous ancestors." Thank you. Thank you for creating that forum. You're asking what are the things that we do that I've seen it changing. The fact that there's a national museum that is allowing a gay guy in Texas to sit and have a conversation with a cool dude in DC about the importance of our community, right? Like that's a phenomenal change. And the fact that that is now going to be included in the history or the archives of my profession is substantial. And thank you for that. And thank you for putting this together, and hopefully these messages resonate with others to stay the course for the right reasons.
That was part 5 of the Pride Behind the Badge series, featuring Michael Crumrine. We hope you'll take some time to explore our digital exhibit, Experience Pride Behind the Badge, the history of LGBTQIA+ in law enforcement. Remember, the companion program for the digital exhibit will air live on YouTube this Wednesday, June 28th at 2 p.m. The register link is in the episode description. We hope you found this conversation enlightening and will join us again for another edition of Icons, where we introduce listeners to incredible people working within law enforcement who have had a profound impact on the community. These one-on-one interviews provide insight into their lives and careers so we can better understand their challenges and recognize their bravery, commitment, and sacrifice. The Icon series is not just about contemporary figures in the law enforcement community, but about all of those who have served their communities and the world, from now and in the past. Be sure to tune back in with us for future Icons episodes exclusively on Tuesdays every month to learn about key figures in American law enforcement history. Please subscribe to Precinct 444 on your favorite podcasting platform to stay connected and to receive our latest content as soon as it drops. We would love to hear from you. Send in your questions, comments, and feedback to precinct444@nleomf.org. You can help us make our content even better. The National Law Enforcement Museum is located at 444 East Street Northwest in Washington, D.C., and is dedicated to telling the story of American law enforcement. We expand and enrich the relationship between law enforcement and the community through educational journeys, immersive exhibitions, and insightful programs. Find us online at lawenforcementmuseum.org and stay tuned for more podcast content from Precinct 444. Until next time, stay safe. We'll see you at the precinct.